couple of months ago, I read a very interesting Times obituary, and I looked at the byline, and the byline was Christopher Lehman Haupt. And I said to myself, he's dead.
The perfect person to do an interview, right?
And yes, he was, but he died in 1995, and he wrote the subject obituary many years ago. And this is one of the nicest things about the Times. They have their best writers write obituaries about important people, and they keep those obituaries in the files and run them no matter what when that person dies. And so Christopher got a byline in his grave. Yeah. So to properly introduce Bill McDonald, I'm going to let Joe Berger speak.
You know, the obituary section is the first section people of a certain age turn to. And Bill McDonald has made it a must-read. He picks people that are so interesting, and picks writers who really bring them to life, and not only bring them to life, but bring the whole era to life. So that when you read an obituary of a politician, you get a sense of what the 60s were like, or the 70s were like. And so I'm very glad to be here talking to you and interviewing you.
Two of my best writers.
Bill has been the obituary editor for 16 years. He's a former editor at Newsday on Long Island. He joined the Times in 1988 and has held numerous positions at the paper. He was the copy chief of the National News Desk, assistant national editor, deputy editor at Arts and Leisure, where I first met you, I think, and deputy culture editor. He was part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting on how races lived in America. He grew up in Stratford, Connecticut, and earned degrees at Fairfield University in Connecticut and Syracuse University. And he's married and lives in Manhattan. So let me start by asking you about a recent obituary. Do you want to say something, Bill?
No, go ahead. Joe, it's all yours.
The lookout for the Watergate burglars. And it's a fascinating story because this guy was supposed to be the lookout, and he screwed up. And as you know, the thing turned into a fiasco. But you was smart enough to decide to do an obituary on him.
Oh, right.
So I want to know. Oh, and the other interesting thing about it was he had been dead for 2 years.
Small fact.
Nobody reported him to the Times, so it didn't. We didn't know about it.
Right.
Tell us what the story is behind that.
Well, we've had a few like this, where someone has died unbeknownst to us, and we've had to come back with an obituary sometimes a year or two later. In this particular case, he was obviously one of the Watergate crew. We would always write about Watergate people. They're just catnip for our readers, I think. So we found out about it actually through the Washington Post. I will give them credit. They scooped us on this one, but they're a Washington paper, so maybe it's understood. He did die a couple years ago, completely, obscurely, but that was no reason not to do the obituary. If he had been written about at the time widely and we had somehow missed it, we probably would not have done that. We would have maybe called him one of those overlooked obits. But in this case, because no one had really reported it before, we thought that gave us complete license to do an obituary as if he had died the day before. So we did it, same as the Post did, and the rest is history. But we've had others like that. In fact, a couple years ago, Jeff Roth, who's here, alerted me to a former Green Beret. His name is Donald W. Duncan, I believe. He turned into an anti-war protester, a major anti-war protester during the Vietnam War, ex-Green Beret. He was the editor of Ramparts, one of the lefty magazines at the time. And Jeff mentioned him and said, you might want to do an advance obit on him. And I thought, okay, I looked into him, looked into his story, and it looked interesting to me. So I said, fine. And I turned to Bob McFadden, who's our ace obituary writer for advances. And I said, Bob, why don't you take a look and see if you can come up with something on him? He came back to me a few hours later and said, Bill, he's dead. He's been dead for years. At least 2 years, I think it was. Really? I had no idea. But we didn't want to drop it at that point either, because, again, we looked into it and said no one had ever written about his death. No one had ever obituarized, if that's the word, him. And he had, the only notice we found of his death was in an obscure paper. He lived on a river town in Ohio, Ohio River town, and it was a small little blurb in the local paper. It mentioned nothing about his background as a Vietnam War protester. Anyway, we did the obit. Long story short, we did the obit, even though he had died a couple years ago, and it was a big hit as an obituary. In a way, it was a great story, and no one else had done it, so we gave him his due, and we got a lot of good reaction from people who said, thank you for doing that, thank you for giving him the credit he deserved. So,
Well, I worry because I did an advance obituary on a rock singer from the early 60s who had one hit and then kind of disappeared. And when I actually called him up to talk about his obituary, about it, telling him that we're going to do an advance obituary on you, which is a whole other question I'm going to ask you about.
okay.
But he's now working as a doorman. And I'm thinking, who's going to know to call me up or call the Obits desk up and say, he died? Because your life takes certain turns and suddenly you're no longer famous.
Right.
So that's going to be interesting to see what happens with that one.
Well, keep your eyes open. That's what I would say.
So how do you decide who gets an obituary? And what criteria do you use?
Well, it's not rocket science. It's all basically basic news judgment, intuition in some ways. Some of it's obvious if someone really achieved fame in some walk of life, whether a sports hero, a movie star, a politician. Those are no-brainers. We, of course, are going to do their obituaries. Where you get into the more nuanced figures would be, people who probably have lived, who did something significant in their own time, maybe changed the world in some way, but maybe did it by flying under the radar in most cases, and their significance is a little bit harder to ferret out. But we look at those kinds of people. We're inundated with suggestions. We probably get 25 a day or so from people who are recommending an obituary. And so we look at what they did in their life. What significance did they, or what did they offer the world that we would need to tell readers about? That whether they made some kind of a contribution that in science, it could be in business, it could be in anything. But basically, the rule of thumb is if you were made news in your life, your death is probably going to be newsy too. So that makes.
Well, you sort of anticipated my question. I should say that I've written a few of them for you, and Bill's pages are among the primest real estate for journalists in the world. There are few assignments that are better than writing for him and telling people stories. And the way that he pairs up people with expertise with the different people they're assigned. And Joe here is a prime example. He keeps coming up with Hasidic rabbis who are 103 years old, and there seems to be an endless supply of them. It's
Joe's our go-to guy.
Yeah, he's the go-to guy. Absolutely unbelievable. How often do living people lobby you for their own advanced obituaries?
That happens more often than you would think. I have a file. I hate, with some disrespect, I suppose, I call them wannabes. Literally, people send me their resumes.
Bill, I'm going to switch your microphones.
Oh, okay. Is this better? Yeah. Oh, sorry. People do send in their material on themselves. They're basically saying to me, you may want to do an obituary for me when the time comes, and I want you to be prepared. And here's my resume, and here's my life story. Sometimes there are photos involved. So I keep them, and you never know. There was one gentleman who was very prominent with the Ford Foundation back in the day in the 60s. And what his main contribution was that he insisted on recipients of Ford Foundation grants to segregate, or to integrate their, whatever institution they were, whether it was a university or a private institute. And they wouldn't get the money unless they would integrate. And this is back in the day when civil rights issues were prominent. He wrote to me, he sent me all this material on himself. And when he did finally die, maybe 2 years later, and I remembered it, so I pulled out all that material and I gave it to the obituary writer. So we had a little base of knowledge right there. Long story short is that, yes, people do send their stuff in.
Just one more two-part question about whether, Michael was saying how long you've been in this job, whether the criteria that you're using to select the 3 or 4 or 5 people every day have changed over the years that you've been doing it.
Okay.
And a question of a little bit more local interest is, how do journalists get in there, and particularly Times people, but not only Times people? And what are you looking for in order to separate those of us who are worthy from those of us who aren't?
It definitely has. When I started at the Times back in the 80s, and I was working on the copy desk, Metro copy desk, and one of our jobs early in the evening would be to write headlines and edit short obits, and many of them were this long, 2 or 3 paragraphs. They had even names, D heads, K heads. I remember all this stuff. M heads, and basically they were 200 to 300 words at most, sometimes even less. And they were people who would be captains of industry and vice president of a bank, investment bank, or maybe they were an advertiser that, in the Times. They were philanthropists, the wife of so-and-so, husband of so-and-so. So we don't do those anymore, as you'll see in the paper. And it's not that these people are unworthy of our attention. They probably just weren't that newsworthy in their time. And we don't think that they are today. We often have pitches from various companies, PR agencies pushing various obits on, a CEO, for example. Well, we look at the CEO, we look at everybody, we give everybody a fair hearing. But we don't have the staff or the time, and we don't want to just boil down people to 3 or 4 paragraphs. We think we want to write a story of their lives and kind of get some texture and richness to it.
I want to amend that question. Okay. We're already at the point now where you're running only 3 or 4 a day, okay? And having arrived at that point, how have your criteria for picking those 3 or 4 changed in the last few years, if they have?
You recognize a good story when you see one, too. I mean, it's a combination of a good narrative tale, yarn, perhaps. Certainly fame, as I mentioned earlier, fame is a criterion, and we do those automatically. If a senator, Senate Majority Leader dies, we do his obit. I think, though, that we, again, have raised the bar above people who maybe they had, noteworthy lives, or not noteworthy lives in their own sense. We don't judge their worthiness as human beings, but their newsworthiness. And so we don't, as I mentioned, do the more obscure, but maybe, a corporate leader, for example, or a beloved professor. We look for people who have contributed something to the world, who offer us a great story in that life, and who we think also might be appealing to the readership. So, combination.
And the racial, ethnic, sexual, whatever mix, has that changed over the past few years?
Yeah, we're much more conscious now, probably, than in the past of representing various parts of the society. We try to keep the standards the same in a sense. If you are, no matter what your race or your religion, if you did something significant, we want to report about that. But we're probably much more conscious of representing, being much more ethnically diverse, certainly more women. And we're making an effort to do that, to look for people and to pay attention to people who may not have caught our attention maybe in years past, but who have a story to tell. And sometimes it's about discrimination, and sometimes it's about a woman who broke the glass ceiling, or a civil rights figure who affected change in our society in some way. And so, yeah, that's part of the mix, part of what our.
And I just want to come back to that journalism question. I feel I have a stake in it. Yeah. I mean, what separates the wannabes from the?
These are the thorniest ones for us, because we know people who die in our field, and often in the newsroom itself, and we're often lobbied and pitched and cajoled to to write obituaries about people who even I may know and remember. And it's the toughest call to make because there's an emotional element to this. Colleagues who are grieving, in effect, for people they knew and want that person to be remembered. So we try to apply the same standard, though, to those people, to our own colleagues, as we would anyone else. So if you did something in the field, in journalism, maybe you won a couple Pulitzer Prizes, maybe you broke some amazing story, maybe you ran a newspaper. We did the former executive editor of the LA Times who made a huge impact on that paper. But we don't do every executive editor of every newspaper. But you still have to have had some kind of, made some kind of, not necessarily made news, but contributed to the field in such a way that it's above and beyond what most people do. So.
What about specializing in obscure rabbis?
But even those rabbis, Joe always makes the case for them, and he's right. They had a lot of influence, a lot of impact. So that's the criterion: influence, impact, fame, those kinds of things.
Well, I'm struck by how many quirky. I don't use that word in a judgmental fashion, but there's obituaries that strike you because they're just really out of left field, but are wonderful to read. There was one that you had on a woman who did played drinking glasses in a Woody Allen film called Broadway Danny Rose. Then you had one on a woman who did plaster casts of the genitals of
rock stars.
Rock stars. She was known as plaster caster.
Yeah.
So how do you make those decisions?
How could you not do those stories, I would say we did both of those. But both of those women made an impression on our world. And I don't mean that, so to speak. Because even the plaster caster, she achieved a measure of fame. She was known in the industry. She was written about in the past. So all those things sort of suggested that, yeah, she had some public profile. And so, is that another double entendre? So we do that. It's a good story. It's a fun story to write, in fact. But again, we have to still make the case that that person had some impact on her corner of the world. Same with the woman with the glasses. She was on Broadway Danny Rose. She was at Carnegie Hall. I think she was in some documentaries. I forget now. But so she sort of checked all the boxes, too, for newsworthiness, I thought.
Have there been obituaries you've regretted running?
Ooh. Nothing really comes to me. There are occasionally, not deep, profound regrets, but there are sometimes we'll assign an obituary thinking that the individual really merits one, really merits a Times obit, and the writer doesn't really come back with a scintillating story and doesn't really make a strong case for it. And so those are somewhat disappointing. Then we might say, well, maybe we shouldn't have done this one. On a couple of occasions, we've actually spiked an obit that just didn't measure up, even though we thought going in. But it's rare. It's rare. Most of what we do, we think we know well enough about it going into it that we're going to publish it. So.
What quality do you look for in a well-wrought obituary?
Well, there's so many things that go into it, but certainly accuracy. You're dealing with minutiae of private lives, and sometimes we get a lot of little stuff wrong, but we try not to. We try to get as many facts as we can right. But you're often dealing with families whose memories may not be completely solid, or they're brushing over things and maybe want to spin it a certain way. So that getting an accurate picture of someone is primary. But I think you have to have a good storytelling writing style, a good narrative skill, and being able to spin a story and decide from that life, sort of pick out what's the narrative thread, you might say. Not that any life has just one, but mainly we're writing about somebody probably for one reason. They did one thing maybe, or they were in a certain position. So that's the spine of the story. And then it's about spinning a tale about that, being inaccurate, writing about the context in which they lived, having a sense of history, as Joe mentioned, bringing to life the era they lived in as well. So understanding all that, having a knowledge of history, and understanding the person you're dealing with. You have to have really.
Are you ever, and you have, quite apart from the who gets the obituaries and who doesn't, which is an awesome power in itself, you also have this power to decree whether somebody gets 800 words or 1,000 words or 1,200. It's a frightening power. Are you ever afraid of that, your own power?
Well, most of my reporters disregard what I say anyway. When I ask them when I say write 800 words, they write 12, which I understand. That is, anybody who's written a story for the newspaper, tend to write. It's harder to write short than long, right? But yeah, that is sort of the measure. It particularly in the print days, that was much more so. I mean, you could determine the Times' judgment of the person's newsworthiness, value by the length of the obit. If it was 300 words, that's probably a minor celebrity. If it's 1,300 words, then the Times think this person's is really, really much more important. So yeah, it is. Column inches could be a measure of what we think of a person, what we think of them as newsmakers. It's a little more lax now online because we have sort of unlimited space. But even there, we do try to hold to length requirements. Bill Clinton will have a 10,000-word obituary, but his Secretary of State might get 3. I don't know. I mean, it is a measure of significance, of historical interest, that kind of thing.
Well, there are people who live too long, for instance, and they're and they're forgotten over time. And you have to sort of shave off words from their obituaries. And can you think of any examples of that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I could probably. We have an obituary written. Yeah, but the short answer is that yes, sometimes they have been sitting around too long and gathering moss, and so we'll either try to revise, refresh them, maybe even redo them if they're really no longer viable, but. We do.
Tell the audience the story of the daredevil woman pilot from the 1920s, who you wrote an advance obituary. It was in the film Obit.
That was not an advance obituary, actually.
Oh,
I don't think.
really?
I don't think so. I think that one was.
It was. There was an advance obituary written in 1924 because people figured she would get killed any day now.
You're right. Thank you. You're refreshing my memory. Yeah, well, Jeff Roth could probably tell you. In the morgue, we have obituaries were done on people many, many years ago, and they kept them in strips of news copy, newsprint. Actually, they were actually printed on paper. So those are the rarities, though.
Right.
That one we probably did use. I'm not sure why someone did that obituary. I think she was a daredevil pilot, so obviously people thought she might not survive a crash. So apparently that's no doubt why that particular obit was done. But yeah, we do cut them when we have to. It's part of what we do. Some people write too long, and then they wrote it 12 years ago, and maybe this person isn't as.
Arthur Sulzberger has a question.
As the Times has become more of a national paper and then increasingly international,
Right.
has the focus on who we cover, who we write obituaries about changed from metro to national to international? How do you think about it from that context? That's question one.
We think of our news organization now as international.
Mm-hmm.
We have readers all over the world, and so yeah, we're much more conscious of people who died in Asia and Africa. Not that we think we're going to have a huge readership, because the numbers are small, in fact. But we're trying to be as encompassing as we can and try to recognize people who really made an impact on a culture that we're not familiar with. But in that world, we've done several recently on some Indian cultural figures who were tremendously popular and icons, in India. Our readers never heard of them probably, but we do them. And we often get people from our India bureau, Delhi bureau, to do them. So.
And the second and last question. Are we going to get to a point where the number of obits we run digitally is going to overcome the number that are in print? In other words,
if the paper shrinks, then yes. But right now, we try to run everything we do online in print as well. There are maybe a couple of exceptions, but almost invariably, what we put online will go into print at some point. They just may not be published simultaneously in the same day. It may be a lag of a few days, or even a week if we don't have the space. So we're dealing there with a finite, space. So we can only do what we can.
The Alden Whitman story that I remember best is he did an interview with Howard Johnson, who agreed, of course, to have his remarks published only after death. And he was portrayed as kind of a sour guy. And the key question was, okay, you invented 28 flavors. And Howard Johnson started ranting about, and the Americans all want vanilla. So Alden Whitman's follow-up question was, okay, what's your favorite flavor? And he said chocolate. So why the other 26 flavors? My question is, what is your favorite anecdote from all these obits?
Oh, wow. Favorite anecdote. There are too many. I think the one I started out with this obit of a guy who had died 2 years earlier is one of my best tales to tell, I think. But, we don't, you caught me off guard here. I don't really have a...
That's a point.
Yeah, I know. There's too many. But I'm going to have to defer on that one right now. If something comes to me, I'll let you know.
I love the obit of the hairdresser for the Stars because she faced a huge challenge in her life and her career spinned out of control, and then she got herself sober. And it was like a real full story of a person with challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Do you like those kind of stories
Oh.
where people face challenges even though they're famous?
Sure, that's what really makes the story, isn't it? When we write about people from all walks of life. But probably the best stories are people who've overcome things, who've either in their own lives, social factors that they have to press against, discrimination, whatever. Alcoholism, it runs the gamut. So yeah, they're the better stories to tell.
Hello, I'm Ira Burko. I was
Hi.
a sports writer
Sure.
at the Times. The year is 1983. I think it was before you became editor of the obituary page.
Yeah,
And Jack Dempsey died in June of, it was May of 1983. And the headline on the obituary page said, Jack Dempsey, former heavyweight champion, dies at age 87. And a few of the writers, including me, were in the sports department at the time. And Joe Vecchione was the sports editor. And the byline on the obituary page was by Red Smith. Red had been dead for about 5 years. So obviously he had done an advance obituary. So Jack Dempsey dies by Red Smith. Joe Vecchione held up the obituary page for the writers around him, and he said, you see, Red writes better dead than you guys do alive.
So, Michael Jackson, Prince, Robin Williams.
yeah.
These are the cases where you didn't have.
Yeah, those are probably the anecdotes that I would bring up.
Tell
Go
me,
ahead.
like, what a nightmare it is to do a real huge obituary
Yeah.
when there's nothing to work with.
That's the anecdotes that I like to forget. We've had a number of cases. It's inevitable. We try to be prepared with as many people as we can. We have about 1,900 advance obits, but there's always somebody who's going to catch you off guard, going to die too young. And Michael Jackson was one. Prince was another. David Bowie, I think. Rock stars seem to die
So
younger
recent
than everyone else. Yeah. So we heard about that one that day. It was about 3 p.m, I believe. I remember this very vividly. We had just put Farrah Fawcett to bed, in effect. She had died that day. And we thought that was our main obit for the day. We were ready to call it a day. And we heard through the grapevine that Michael Jackson may have died. So we mobilized in a way. It wasn't just the obit desk, because this is a national story. So obviously people from up high, masthead editors as well, got involved. The national desk got involved. We had people in Hollywood on the scene, going to his house, etc., going to the hospital where he was in. So it became a mobilizing effort. It was a panic. We only had so many hours to to get something into print. It was 3 o'clock, maybe 3 or 4 hours to write his entire story. But it was one of those cases where the Times really came, showed up and really did what it can do when it really wants to. It mobilized. We drew from all kinds of people. Our rock critic got involved, wrote a long essay about him. So in some ways, it was an example of panic, terror, but also great pride because we could pull this off, and we did. We did it within hours. It was amazing.
When Alden Whitman was writing Obits famously for the Times, and I know you weren't the editor back then, his MO, as I understand it, was to have very deep background interviews with people with the promise that nothing they told him would appear publicly until after their death. And what I was wondering was about the journalistic ethics of that, because suppose subject A told him something that was eminently fit to print. The Times was going to hold that until that person died. What can you speak, even though it wasn't your time?
Yeah,
Can you speak to the journalistic ethics of that?
that's a thorny one. I think that it would have to be discussed at probably at the highest levels. If somebody said something that we needed to report right away, if someone confessed to him, who knows? That's never happened, so luckily I've never had to face that dilemma. We have interviewed people, we do it routinely, and on a few occasions they'll have said something that we promised we were not going to print this, so they're a little more free to speak. I think Mayor Ed Koch, said something disparaging about Mario Cuomo in a video interview for us, and it wasn't earth-shattering, but it was revealing, and it didn't come out until he died, and we published this video. Jean Kirkpatrick told us about a secret mission she did to Europe during the Reagan years. She was the UN ambassador, and which we had never known, and so we put that into the obit. It was a little nugget, but it had never been reported before, and she disclosed it to us. But we did not think that was so earth-shattering that we would have to report this now. It was just it's ancient history in some ways. But the question you're asking is a good question, and I don't know if I have a ready answer or an answer that will cover all contingencies. There might be a case where someone, I guess it's almost similar to what a patient might tell a doctor or a psychiatrist. How much confidentiality can you expect? So if it was something egregious, really heinous, I think we would probably have to break that promise. I think we would. But for the greater good, you might say.
Has anyone ever pressed you to read their advanced obituaries in advance?
Oh, all the time. They all.
Any good examples of that? And what kinds of security provisions do you make to keep these things under wraps?
We do not let the subjects read their own obituaries. The writer may want to read back certain passages to make sure we get the facts right, but we'll never let them have any kind of veto power or even see it. That would be a breach. We don't let other news organizations see what we do. It's all very proprietary information. I'm always surprised that more don't leak out because we have newsroom people all around the newsroom who could easily go into our files, but that's not happened. But
Could you talk a little bit about the delicacy of interviewing somebody while they're still living? Because I know that makes some people uncomfortable.
It does, yeah.
And others understand perfectly.
right, it's either or. It seems either someone is enthusiastic about having a voice in their own obituary and will agree to an interview. One of your members, Bob McFadden, is the master of reaching out to people, and he has a whole manner about doing it that's quite remarkable to overhear on the phone. Others, though, are appalled at the idea and slam down the phone. We always found that Hollywood people, for some reason, and their agents, publicists, would slam down the phone. They don't want to consider it. I don't want to generalize, but that's been, in my experience, we're less likely to get interviews with a star from Hollywood, or what have you. But others are very willing to.
Well, I guess many people are just happy that they're going to have an obituary in the Times.
Well, that's part of it. I think someone will say, I'm honored that you're calling me, and they weren't expecting it. So, sure, there's a...
And you can always tell them, well, don't worry, you'll never have to read it.
And we always tell them that there's the urban legend that, if you read an interview, you get at least 10 more years. So,
Yeah, there you go.
which is often the case.
If I'm not mistaken, one former publisher of the New York Times was caught trying to get his advance obit. He was caught, this is my grandfather, sneaking into the advance obit area, trying to find his advance obit before he died, but they kicked him out, right?
Before my time.
Before your time, before my time. You were talking about Ed Koch, and Ed Koch, of course, did one of the most powerful video obits, and the advance obits. I don't know if any of you remember it. It was him looking in the camera and saying, "Do you miss me?" But we don't do video obits anymore, do we? Or do we still?
We're not doing them. We have about 10 more left. That's I wish we could. If you have any influence, Arthur, I wish we could do more. It was a great project, but I think the production values are really high. I sat in on a few, which was fascinating. Ted Sorensen, I sat next to him, and I gave him a story about. Long story short, that I had seen Kennedy in his early days. Can I tell you that anecdote? Actually, it's kind of interesting. Okay, so Ted Sorensen was having this interview for this project, which we have phased out now somewhat. And anyway, I wanted to talk to him afterwards because Kennedy had been such a big presence in my family growing up. We were sort of Kennedy Democrats and such. So I told him a story of when I was a boy. John Kennedy came through town in a motorcade in Little Stratford, Connecticut, obscure place no one cares about. He was on his way to a political event, I think in New Haven or Waterbury or someplace like that. And anyway, so we all went down to the street, watched him go by. He was waving at people. It was a thrilling moment for a little kid. He was this, icon. Anyway, so I asked Sorensen about that. I said, I never understood why was he going through our town? And he told me the story. And he said that Kennedy was there. It was right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy was there to sort of present the image that all was well, that there was no crisis going on in Washington. And so he wanted to carry through with this engagement he had already scheduled. And he went on to do it, gave a speech. And it was all about, the background was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And who knew? And I only learned that from Sorensen, so that was a great moment. But anyway, to get to your point, though, the project is sort of phasing out, and we'd like to resume.
Have you ever approached the obits from not an editorial point of view, but as a profit center and sort of a baseball model where you could have a AAA obits, and so the business section could have 5 obits, and because you're online.
Mm-hmm.
The sports section could have obits. The art section, you're doing a wonderful job of editing it because I get to read somebody's obit who I never knew about. It's very informative.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me to be your number one mission. But it also sometimes seems to me, because I'm an old business investigative correspondent,
mm-hmm.
that you leave out some big guys who are too conventional.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder whether there's a way to publish that, maybe with video, as Arthur mentioned, and convince the current publisher that the Times could make more money and get more readers by having more obits.
About business people.
About everybody.
About everyone.
Section by section.
I'm completely in agreement with you. I wish we could do more. I wish we had a bigger staff. I wish I could get more obituaries out of the other desks, the business desk and the science desk, because I often have to go around beg and plead for them to help us out. We have a small crew, but sure, I would love to expand this. I think it's a great franchise. I think we have it kind of to ourselves. There aren't too many. There really is no competition. The Brits have some good obituary pages. The nearest thing to us is probably Washington Post, and I don't think they're half as good, frankly. And I know their editor is a good guy, but he is facing lots of budget constraints. So anyway, I think I always thought the Times could capitalize, you might say, on this franchise a little more than it does. But I don't make those calls, unfortunately.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but you mentioned a woman aviator who was such a daredevil, you
Yeah.
had her obit in advance. I was just wondering, I don't want to suggest it, but could it have been Bessie Coleman, or do you remember the name of the person?
I don't remember the name offhand, I'm sorry. There you go.
Eleanor
Thank you,
Smith.
Jeff.
Thank you.
A relative or close person of someone that person has died.
I don't recall that ever happening. Usually it's the other way around. They tell us. We've had a few cases where people we were asked to withhold the publishing the obituary until next of kin or people very close to this person was. It was Stephen Sondheim, actually. We knew about his death, and we agreed that they did not want us to release it until certain members of his family and close to him knew about his death. They didn't want to have them find out online. And so we agreed to hold off because no one else knew it was competitive, or it wasn't competitive at that point. We were the only ones who knew that he had died. And so we did hold off for a couple hours. And that finally they got around to telling people they needed to tell, including people at some Sondheim revivals on Broadway. They wanted to tell the casts. They wanted to tell the directors. There were matinee shows going on. They wanted the shows to end. They couldn't come down and then tell them. So we said, okay, we'll wait. And finally they said, fine. They gave us till we gave them till like 5 o'clock or something like that. And we pushed the button finally. And that broke the news of his death, actually, that we were the first to know.
It's interesting how often so many of your stories come back to the morgue and Jeff Roth. We pointed out many times, and I'm embarrassing him right now, I'm sure. But I remember that Jeff told me that he subscribes to all of these obscure journals, including one for inventors.
Yeah.
And he had a list of people who had invented various famous things who were still around that nobody had ever heard of, sort of taking off on the Robert McGee Thomas famous obituary about the inventor of kitty litter. And maybe can you think of other instances where Jeff has come forward and said, the guy that invented XYZ is still around, you should do him?
Jeff is this great resource for us. He's the unsung hero of our group. Those are the kind of people exactly the kind of people we want to do. The people who invented kitty litter. Or we had one, the guy who designed the pink flamingos that were sprouting on lawns all over, I think, the 50s, 60s. And he created these, remember the pink, they put them in the ground. And Margot Fox, the great Margot Fox, one of our great obit writers, wrote his story. And it was so good. And it was on the front page. So it was amazing. So those are the kind of things that we love. That's makes our day.
I'm just wondering if you all read the Obits and the Economist, because I have several friends who all agree that they are so good that it's worth the subscription just to read the Obits. That's some of the best reading out there.
It is. They're very good. I envy them. They have one they can do one a week, and they don't have to worry about being timely and against deadlines. So, and they have the world. They can pick one person. Well, they are good. I mean, I do admire them. And it's a different beast. We're a daily newspaper, but yeah.
But their voice is different, right? The British obituaries are often almost first person, and people are reminiscing about folks that they've known, and they're kind of eccentric in a way, and that the times wouldn't be.
No,
the tone is different.
We have a different tone, and you're right. They often are subjective. They often leave out pertinent facts as well, we find, including there was one famous case where they reported a ballerina dead. This was in 2004, I believe. We ran with the story in New York. I wasn't on the desk at the time, but anyway, it turned out the ballerina was not in fact dead. She was alive and well, living on the Upper West Side. And but the Brits had reported her dead, and so they got it wrong. We just piggybacked on that and got it wrong. So it ended up an embarrassing correction and retraction or correction. But they have, that's what they do. They're a little looser than we are. We always insist on telling you how we know somebody died. The second graph, Al Siegel used to be the former AME, was the one really instituted that rule that in the wake of this ballerina story, to say in the second graph or somewhere someone's in the piece, how we know so-and-so died, who told us? We just don't know it by, osmosis.
But what age do you have to be before the cause of death is not mentioned?
There's no limit. It used to be, there was a rule when before my time, actually, I think it was Joe Lillyveld, who thought that anybody over 85, we didn't need to state the cause. But I don't know if you remember Larry Altman, who also covered medical issues for the paper for years, Dr. Larry Altman. He made the case to me, and he said, everybody, we should give the cause for anybody if we know it. Because even if you're 95, even if you're 100, there's still a cause, and it's part of the story. It's news. It's a fact. Why hide it? Why withhold it? And so that's our philosophy. If we know the cause, even if it's a centenarian, if it's a specific cause, we'll write it. We'll print it.
There are other quirks to a Times obituary. For example, you always have the maiden name of a wife, for example. We have to have a maiden name. Try to get the parents' names of. So a person who finishes an obituary in 2 or 3 hours spend the next 2 or 3 hours tracking down a maiden name. Where are those rules from? How does that evolve?
They're not really rules. They're just, to me, they're part of the story of a person. I mean, if it's a woman who took her husband's name, I think we should kind of know what name she had when she was born. So we think that's a pertinent fact. It's part of one's life. So again, there's no rule against it or for it. If we can't find out, we're not going to hold the obituary up for that. We're going to look for the information. If we don't have the information, we can only report what we're told. In some cases, we just have to leave it out. But again, no hard fast rules. Okay.
What do you still have to do when the Queen of England
Kill it. Yeah, we're ready to go with her. Every time she has a cold, we have to go back and look at it, make sure it's okay. We've just updated it recently because she didn't appear for her annual speech to Parliament, or whatever that was. So we have Alan Kyle, a reporter who wrote the piece, who's now retired, but he is staying on top of it, and he sent us a couple of sentences just the other day. But those are the hardest ones to keep up with when they're active, and yet once they do, you're going to have to be quick and get it up quickly online.
I've got a question. This gets back to the morgue, because I find that the paper clips that we have are incredibly useful in terms of finding like little quirky information, and also because you can trust it because it's appeared in the New York Times, or you hope you can trust it because it appeared in the New York Times. But at some point, that's going to get phased out. And talk about a little bit about sort of the switch to research online, which, I mean, now you do a combination. You've got the print and you've got the online. But it seems like online it's harder to trust sources and it's harder to find quirky information, that there's little grace notes that make it obit.
I mean, Jeff could probably speak to that. He's not here. But yeah, one of the beauties of the clip file, the yellowing old newspaper clips in manila folders, you would often find whoever was doing this back years ago, 30, 40, 50 years ago, clipping out articles from Collier's and Saturday Evening Post and magazines that no longer exist, or newspapers, New York Herald Tribune. So you'd find these little gems that aren't online. But trusting what's online is always, it's a challenge, because there's a lot of disinformation out there, or just not deliberately so, but just bad information. The birth date was wrong.
Is there ever such a thing as a slow death day?
A slow death day? Absolutely. And those are the best days, actually. We don't like fast death days because we have to work too hard. There are times when things are kind of slow, and we can then focus on other things, which is great. We can work on advanced obits, and we're sort of at the whim of fates. We don't know. Some days you might get 3 or 4 well-known people all going at the same time, and it's other days.
What do you do if you have a whole page to fill?
We give it back. Actually, there's never been a day in my time here that we haven't had at least one obituary every day, and so there's always going to be something. And even if we have to hold it to fill that space, but it's just not. It just doesn't happen. There's no end. The supply is unending, and the people who, as our former deputy used to say, the Lord will provide. And it's true. There's just no, there are too many people to write about, and we can only do a fraction. So our challenge is, trying to do as many as we can, not worry about a slow day.
Well, on that note, go ahead.
I'm just glad that we have you as an obituary editor, because you're a calm, steady, cool presence dealing with this massive subject, obviously.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
And a wise one.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.